On the last morning anyone saw him alive, the sky over the Marshall Islands was almost gentle. Broken cloud at 3,000 feet, a warm wind coming off the lagoon, the kind of Pacific morning that transport pilots called easy flying. A 4-engine airplane lifted off the Coral runway at Kwajalein at 11:15, climbed out over the water, and turned northeast toward Hawaii. On board were 10 men. One of them wore 3 silver stars on each shoulder. He was one of the most senior officers in the entire Pacific, a lieutenant general who commanded every Army Air Forces unit under Admiral Chester Nimitz, and he was flying to Washington to win an argument that he believed was getting his own airmen killed. At 12:15, the aircraft made a routine radio call and reported its position over open ocean. After that, nothing. No distress call, no wreckage, no oil on the water, no life raft, nothing at all. For 3 weeks, the Navy flew search patterns across a stretch of the Pacific larger than the state of Texas, and in all that ocean, they never recovered as much as a single rivet. Now here is the part that should stop you. Name the highest-ranking American airman lost in the Pacific in the Second World War. Take a second with it. Most people who know this war cold, the people who can tell you the tail markings of a bomb group and the block number of a Mustang from across a room, still cannot come up with him. His own name went onto an air base and then quietly came off again. The base most people picture when they hear the family name honors a different man entirely. A brigadier general who happened to be sitting a few feet away from him on that same lost airplane. His younger brother is far better remembered than he is, and I think that is one of the strangest injustices in the whole history of American air power, because the man on that transport was not a bystander to events. For 2.5 years, he was one of the most important air commanders the United States had in the Pacific. The reason you have never heard of him is not an accident. It is the entire point of this story. His name was Millard Fillmore Harmon. His friends called him Miff. And to understand why a 3-star general could vanish from the sky and then vanish from memory, you have to start a long way from that lagoon, in a country that had not yet decided it believed in air power at all. He was born on the 19th of January, 1888, at Fort Mason in San Francisco. That matters, because the Harmons were an Army family down to the bone. His father was a career officer, and Miff was not the only son to follow the flag. There were 3 Harmon brothers, and all 3 would rise to be general officers, which is a rare thing in any nation's history. Kenneth, the eldest, became a colonel. Hubert, the youngest, became a lieutenant general and the first superintendent of the United States Air Force Academy. And here is the first landmine I want to clear before we go one step further, because I know this audience, and I know somebody is already typing it. You will read in 100 lazy retellings that Miff Harmon was a West Point classmate of Dwight Eisenhower. He was not. Miff graduated from West Point in the class of 1912. It was his little brother Hubert who graduated in 1915, the famous class the stars fell on, alongside Eisenhower and Omar Bradley. Get that wrong in the comments, and somebody will correct you, and they will be right too. Miff was 3 years ahead, and according to the historian John Rickard, who wrote one of the few careful accounts of his career, he graduated 74th in a class of 95. Not a top cadet, not a golden boy. A solid, middle-of-the-pack infantry officer, commissioned into the foot soldiers, with no obvious destiny in the air at all. The air found him anyway. In 1916, still a young officer, he was detailed to the aviation section of the Signal Corps, which is what the United States called its air arm before anyone took it seriously. He flew patrols during the punitive expedition into Mexico, chasing Pancho Villa across the desert in machines made of wood and fabric and wire. When America entered the First World War, Harmon went to France, trained in Paris, and flew as a pursuit pilot attached to a French combat group during some of the hardest fighting on the Western Front. He came home with the Croix de Guerre, the French War Cross, and something more valuable than a medal. He came home as one of the small handful of American officers who had actually flown in combat, who knew from the cockpit what the theorists only knew from the chalkboard. That distinction is going to matter enormously later, so hold on to it. Miff Harmon was not a desk man who wandered into aviation. He was a flyer first. Let me give you a sense of what that meant in those years, because it is easy to say a man was an early aviator and hard to feel it. When Harmon learned his trade, an airplane was a contraption of spruce and linen and bracing wire with an engine that might quit for no reason and a cockpit open to the wind. There were no parachutes worth the name in the beginning. Pilots died in accidents on clear days at a rate that would ground an Air Force now. To choose aviation in that era was to accept a level of personal risk that most officers would not touch, and Harmon chose it and kept choosing it. Through the border patrols and the skies over France and 2 decades of peacetime flying that killed a steady stream of good men. By the time the Second World War came, he had been flying for more than 25 years. He was not a staff officer who had pinned on wings for the prestige. He was a man who had spent his life in cockpits and had buried friends who had not walked away from theirs. I think that history is why he never lost sight of the men at the sharp end. When he argued about how to use the fighters, when he worried about the crews crossing that ocean, he was not moving symbols on a map. He knew, in his hands and his gut, what it was to be the man in the airplane. Between the wars, he did the unglamorous work that builds a real airman. He commanded the primary flying school at March Field in California. He opened Barksdale Field in Louisiana and led a pursuit group there for the better part of 4 years. He commanded in Hawaii in the middle 1930s. And he served as an instructor and then assistant commandant at the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field in Alabama, which is a detail I want you to underline in your mind. The tactical school was the intellectual furnace of American air power. It was the place where a small group of true believers worked out the doctrine of high-altitude daylight precision bombing, the theory that a formation of bombers could fly deep into enemy territory in daylight, without fighter escort, and hit a target with such accuracy that a handful of missions could break an enemy's ability to fight. Harmon was inside that building while that theory was being forged. He knew the men who built it. He knew the elegance of it, and I suspect he came to know its blind spots better than they did, because he was one of the few in the room who had actually been shot at from a cockpit. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for a real Pacific Command story, and some of you have personal connections to this one. I want to do it justice, so if you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to Miff Harmon, and to the moment the whole world caught fire. When the war came, it came for the Army Air Forces, as an organization that had to grow faster than any military institution in American history. And the man building it, driving it, whipping it forward through sheer force of will was Henry Harley Arnold, known to everyone as Hap. Arnold needed men he could trust at the top of his headquarters, and in January of 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, he brought Harmon in as Chief of the Air Staff of the Army Air Forces. Think about what that job was. Harmon sat at the center of the machine that was rationing airplanes and pilots and engines and fuel among every theater in a two-ocean war. Every request from every front landed on desks near his. He helped decide who got what and who had to wait. He was, for a few crucial months, one of the men holding the pencil that divided up the war. And then, in the summer of 1942, they sent him to the place where there was never enough of anything. On the 1st of July, 1942, Harmon was named Commanding General of United States Army Forces in the South Pacific area. He reached Noumea, on the island of New Caledonia, on the 26th of July. 1 week later, on the 7th of August, the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore on a malarial island most Americans had never heard of. The island was called Guadalcanal, and the 6-month campaign to hold it would become one of the most desperate battles of the entire war. Here's where the story starts to bite, and here's where you meet the problem that shaped the rest of Miff Harmon's life, and in the end, his death. The South Pacific was a Navy theater. The overall commander was an admiral, first Robert Gormley, and then, from the 20th of October 1942, the famous fighting admiral William Halsey, the man they called Bull. Under the way the theater was organized, Harmon, an Army Lieutenant General with a lifetime in aviation, did not actually command the Army's airplanes in combat. Operational control of air operations ran through the Naval Air Commander. What Harmon controlled was everything else: training, supply, the vast web of island bases, the administration and welfare of every soldier and airman in the theater, tactical command of the Army's ground troops. He was, in effect, the man who had to build and feed and sustain the machine while somebody else decided how to swing it. Now, a lesser man, or a more selfish one, would have spent that job fighting for his own prerogatives and letting the mission suffer. Harmon did the opposite, and this is the first thing I genuinely admire about him. He made the theater work. The historian Thomas Alexander Hughes, who wrote the single best modern study of Harmon, an essay called A General Airman in the journal Joint Force Quarterly, records the verdict of the men above him. Halsey himself wrote that he was, in his words, particularly fortunate in having Harmon as commanding general of the Army forces, and that Harmon's sound advice and wholehearted cooperation were outstanding contributions to the joint effort. Nimitz called his selection first-rate. Coming from the Navy, about an Army airman, in the middle of the most inter-service jealousy of the whole war, that is extraordinary praise. Halsey liked him so much that he personally recommended Harmon for his 3rd star, and that trust was earned in the hardest possible circumstances. Remember what the South Pacific was in the autumn of 1942. Guadalcanal hung by a thread. The Navy had lost so many warships in the Black Water north of the island that the sailors renamed that stretch of sea Iron Bottom Sound. Supplies were desperately short. Men were falling to malaria as fast as they were falling to enemy fire. Into that chaos came an Army airman who could easily have spent his energy defending his own service's turf, and instead spent it making the whole joint machine run. When Gormley was relieved and Halsey took over in the darkest days of October, the tempo of the entire theater changed, and Harmon changed with it, feeding the fight with every airplane and every ton of supply he could scrape together. I think it takes a particular kind of discipline to subordinate your own ambition to a mission that will hand the glory to a man in a different uniform. Harmon had that discipline. It is the mark of a real professional. And it is also, as we will see, exactly the quality that a later, prouder, more independent Air Force would find it very convenient to forget. And let me put some hard numbers on the mountain Harmon was trying to move, because this audience respects the arithmetic. When he arrived and took his first hard look at what he actually had, in late August of 1942, the Army's air strength across the South Pacific was almost pitiful against the distances involved. By one accounting drawn from the records, he had roughly 24 B, 24 Liberators, about 33 B, 17 Flying Fortresses, and 16 P, 39 Airacobras on Fiji, with another 27 P, 400s, a pair of P, 39s, and a couple of P, 43s on New Caledonia. That was the force expected to help cover a theater that spanned thousands of miles of empty ocean. The heavy bombers spent most of their hours not bombing but searching, flying endless reconnaissance patrols across that emptiness. And when they did attack enemy ships, their hit rate, by the honest figures, ran at something close to 1%. 1 hit in 100 tries. That is the reality behind the legend of the war-winning bomber, and Harmon lived inside that reality every single day. His answer was to fight for a dedicated Army Air Force in the theater, a real numbered command with its own identity and its own logistics. He pushed it up the chain, and General Marshall approved it. And on the 13th of January, 1943, Harmon stood up the 13th Air Force at Espiritu Santo under Major General Nathan Twining. The men who flew it gave it a nickname that told you everything about the conditions. They called it the Jungle Air Force. It operated eventually from more than 40 island airfields carved out of coral and mud, a scattered, improvised, deadly effective organization that ground the Japanese down across the Solomons. And Harmon did not run this war from a headquarters chair. In December of 1942, he flew up to Guadalcanal itself, walked the ground, and threw his weight behind the final offensive that broke the last organized Japanese resistance on the island in early February of 1943. Later that year, during the brutal fight for New Georgia, when the advance bogged down in the jungle around the airfield at Munda, Halsey sent Harmon forward to fix it. And Harmon made one of the hardest calls a commander can make. He relieved a fellow Major General, John Hester, in the middle of the battle over the furious objection of the Navy's own amphibious commander, Admiral Kelly Turner. He put Major General Oscar Griswold in charge, and Munda fell in the first days of August. That is not a paperwork general. That is a man who understood that the mission comes before everyone's comfort, including his own. Let me stay in the Solomons a moment longer, because the scale of what the Jungle Air Force did under Harmon's stewardship deserves more than a sentence. As the campaign climbed the island chain, the air command he fed and sustained grew from that pitiful handful of bombers into a real striking force. Newer airplanes arrived. The P-38 Lightning, with the range to reach far up the Solomons, became the dominant Army fighter in the theater, and it was P-38s of this command that would fly the most famous interception of the entire Pacific Air War. The P-39 and the export model P-400, outclassed as dogfighters, found brutal work down low, strafing barges and troops. The heavy bombers, the Liberators, and the Fortresses kept up their long reconnaissance patrols and their strikes against airfields and shipping. And all of it operated across distances that would have staggered a commander in Europe. A single mission in the Solomons might mean 600 miles of open water each way, over jungle and reef and shark-filled sea, with no place to put down if an engine failed. Harmon's job was to keep that machine supplied and manned and based, to carve airfields out of coral, to move fuel and bombs and spare engines across an ocean, and to do all of it while the Navy set the operational priorities. By the time the Americans reached Bougainville at the end of 1943, the air power Harmon had built and sustained had helped drive Japanese air strength in the region toward collapse. He did not fly the missions. He made the missions possible. And in a theater that ran on logistics far more than on heroics, That was the whole difference between winning and losing. In my view, if the story ended there, Harmon would already deserve a place in the memory of this war. He took a starving, scattered theater and made it a machine that won. But the story does not end there, because in 1944, the Army Air Forces handed him the largest and most modern striking force in the world, and then made sure he could not actually command it. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the airplane that changed everything. The B-29 Superfortress, a 4-engine bomber so advanced it made the flying fortress look like a relic, pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, a combat radius that could reach the Japanese home islands from bases thousands of miles away. It was the single most expensive weapons program of the entire war, more expensive even than the atomic bomb, and Hap Arnold had staked his reputation and the future independence of the Air Force on it. And Arnold made a decision about that airplane that is at the dead center of our story. Before we follow that decision, understand what the airplane actually asked of the men who supported it, because it explains why Harmon's burden was so enormous. The Superfortress was a generation ahead of anything that had flown before it. It cruised at over 30,000 feet in a pressurized cabin. It aimed its remote-controlled guns through a primitive computer, and its 4 engines were so highly strained that, in the early days, they had a dangerous habit of catching fire on the climb. Each one of these machines was a temperamental marvel that devoured fuel and spare parts and skilled maintenance at a rate no previous bomber had ever approached. To put a few hundred of them over Japan meant moving mountains of material across the widest ocean on Earth, and stockpiling it on islands that 18 months earlier had been enemy jungle. That was the true weight of the Superfortress campaign, and most of that weight fell on the man responsible for the bases and the supply, which is to say it fell on Miff Harmon. He would not give it to the theater commanders, not to MacArthur, not to Nimitz, not to anyone in the Pacific. On the 4th of April, 1944, Arnold created the 20th Air Force and commanded it himself personally from a desk in Washington, reporting directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was the only numbered Air Force in American history commanded from the capital, more than 8,000 miles from the airplanes it controlled. The theater commanders were told, in effect, that their job was to build the runways, defend the bases, and deliver the fuel and bombs, and then to stand aside while Washington decided what the superfortresses would do. And into this arrangement, on the 1st of August, 1944, stepped Miff Harmon. His new title was Commanding General of the Army Air Forces in the Pacific Ocean areas, under Admiral Nimitz, and he was given a second hat as well, Deputy Commander of the 20th Air Force, under Arnold. Read those two titles together, and you can already feel the trap closing. He answered to a naval theater commander for most of his job, and he answered to Arnold in Washington for the bombers, and he did not have real operational control of the very weapon that everyone in the world was watching. He was responsible for the buildup. He was responsible for the bases on Saipan and Tinian and Guam, for the fuel and the runways and the endless logistics of putting hundreds of the most complicated aircraft ever built into the sky over Japan. But the decisions about how those bombers would be used were made by other men. And I want to be precise about the one piece of real operational authority Harmon did receive, because it sharpens the injustice rather than softening it. In December of 1944, Admiral Nimitz gave Harmon command of what was called the Strategic Air Force of the Pacific Ocean areas, a task organization that placed the land-based Army and Navy search and strike aircraft of the Central Pacific under his operational control. On paper, that made him a genuine air commander at last, running the 7th Air Force and the long-range patrol and strike squadrons across a huge stretch of ocean. But there was a line drawn straight through the middle of it, and the line was the Superfortress. The one weapon that mattered most, the one the whole world was watching, the one his bases and his fuel and his runways existed to serve, was explicitly carved out of his authority and kept in Washington. So Harmon reached the winter of 1945 holding real operational control of the aircraft that were not decisive and no operational control of the aircraft that were. He was the deputy commander of the 20th Air Force who was forbidden to command the 20th Air Force. It was a cruel arrangement, and it was about to get crueler. And if this sounds familiar, if you have ever watched the person who actually understands the work get handed all of the responsibility and none of the authority, while the credit and the control sat with someone far away from the floor, then you already understand the shape of what happened to Harmon. You are not imagining that pattern. It is older than any of us. It just does not usually put a man on an airplane he never comes back from. The strain was there from the start, and it was not hidden. Hughes quotes a letter Arnold wrote to Harmon in the summer of 1944, warning him bluntly that if he could not reconcile what Arnold called his conflicting loyalties, his loyalty to Nimitz and the theater on one side, and to Arnold and the Army Air Forces on the other, then Arnold would relieve him as deputy. Imagine being told that. You have been handed an impossible dual command by the same man who is now threatening to fire you for the impossibility of it. For a few months, the build-up ground forward. The first superfortress reached Saipan on the 12th of October, 1944, flown in by Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, who commanded the bomber force in the field. The early missions were a bitter disappointment, flying high, in daylight, aiming for precision, exactly the doctrine born in that schoolhouse at Maxwell where Harmon had once taught. The superfortresses could not hit what they were aiming at. The winds at 30,000 feet, winds we now call the jet stream, scattered their bombs across the landscape. On the first major raid against Tokyo from the Marianas, on the 24th of November, 1944, more than 100 B-29s went out, and only a fraction managed to put their bombs anywhere near the primary target. The beautiful theory was failing again in a new ocean with a new airplane. And here the numbers tell the story better than any adjective. On that first Marianas strike against Tokyo, on the 24th of November, 1944, 111 superfortresses were dispatched. Only 88 of them managed to drop their bombs at all, and of those, only 24 put their bombs anywhere near the primary target, an aircraft engine plant on the edge of the city. From nearly 6 miles up, fighting winds nobody had planned for, the great campaign opened with a whimper. Behind that failure stood an infrastructure of almost unimaginable size, and it was Harmon's infrastructure. The Marianas would hold 5 great bomber airfields, 2 on Tinian, 1 on Saipan, and 2 on Guam, each one built to base a wing of roughly 180 superfortresses. The runways ran 8,000 feet and more, hacked and blasted and rolled out of jungle and coral by engineer battalions working around the clock. Every gallon of aviation fuel, every bomb, every spare engine for the most complicated aircraft ever mass-produced had to be carried thousands of miles across the ocean and stockpiled on those islands before a single mission could fly. That was Harmon's war. Not the glory of the target, but the grinding, endless, decisive work of making the target reachable at all. When Arnold finally lost patience with the precision doctrine and replaced Hansell with LeMay in January of 1945, and when LeMay in turn transformed the campaign, it was Harmon's foundation that all of it was built upon. He gets none of the credit for what those bases produced. He did the work that made the credit possible. And so, on the 20th of January, 1945, Arnold replaced Hansell with a hard-driving major general named Curtis LeMay, who would soon throw out the doctrine entirely and send the bombers in low and at night. But that is a story I have told before, and it is not this story. This story is about the man one level above that change, the man who was supposed to be coordinating the whole Pacific air effort, and about the fight that was about to cost him his life. Because in the winter of 1945, Miff Harmon got into a dispute that he was absolutely right about, and lost. Understand why this mattered so much to him? Because it was not vanity and it was not turf. Harmon had watched for 2.5 years what happened when air power was used rigidly, when a beautiful idea was applied without regard to the reality in front of it. He had seen the heavy bombers sent to sink ships they could not hit. He had seen the precision doctrine fail over the Solomons and fail again over Tokyo. He had learned, the hard way, that the most valuable thing a commander can preserve is flexibility, the ability to shift his forces to where they are actually needed, rather than freezing them to a single plan drawn up in advance. And now, with the long-range Mustangs finally within reach, he saw the same mistake being set up again. Lock the fighters to bomber escort and nothing else, and you throw away their reach, their speed, their ability to strike Japanese airfields and shipping across the whole theater. It was, to Harmon, a waste of the one weapon that could do the most. He was not protecting his prerogatives. He was trying to prevent what he genuinely believed was a squandering of American air power in the final push against Japan. That is why he was willing to fly halfway around the world to make the case. He thought the decision was wrong on the merits, and the best historians who have studied it since have concluded that he was right. The subject was fighters, long-range fighters. As the Americans took Iwo Jima, they could finally base P-51 Mustangs close enough to escort the bombers over Japan and to strike Japanese targets on their own. The question was, who would control those fighter groups? Harmon, drawing on everything he had learned across 2.5 years of Pacific War, argued that the long-range fighters should not be frozen, chained permanently to bomber escort duty and nothing else. He wanted the flexibility to use them where the theater needed them, to vest that operational control in the commanders who could see the whole picture on the spot. It was, frankly, the more sophisticated and more correct understanding of how air power actually works. You do not lock your most flexible weapon into a single roll. The official history of the Army Air Forces, written by Wesley Frank Craven and James Lee Cate, lays out the collision. On the 23rd of January, 1945, Arnold decided to assign the fighter groups to the 20th Air Force. LeMay, down in the Marianas, insisted that he must have absolute operational control of the fighters, and LeMay, as he usually did, prevailed. Harmon protested that the outcome would be, in his words, a seriously inefficient use of the forces. He believed the arrangement would waste the very flexibility that made the fighters valuable. Here is the verdict of the historian Thomas Alexander Hughes, and I want you to sit with it, because it is the moral center of this whole video. Hughes writes that in this dispute it was Harmon, and not LeMay, who occupied the doctrinal high ground. The junior man won the argument. The senior man was right. And that is why Miff Harmon got on an airplane. He was not fleeing anything. He was not being reassigned in disgrace. He was flying to Washington to argue his case in person, to force a resolution of the command arrangement he was certain was wrong, to try one more time to get the authority to match his responsibility. John Rickard, in his account of Harmon's career, puts it in a single devastating line. This confused command structure, he writes, would cost Harmon his life. Let me tell you exactly what we know about that flight, because this audience deserves the facts and not the fog, and because the details themselves are the mystery. The aircraft was a C-87A Liberator Express. Now, some casual accounts will tell you a B-24 bomber went down that day, and I want to be precise because you will want to be precise in the comments. The C-87 was the transport version of the B-24 Liberator. Same wing, same four engines, but the bomb bay was gone, replaced with a cabin for passengers and cargo. It carried no turrets and no guns. It was, in plain terms, an unarmed airliner built on a bomber's bones. The specific machine, according to the records kept by Pacific Rex, carried the serial number 4124174. The pilot was Major Francis Savage. The flight had left Guam the day before, on the 25th of February, and reached Kwajalein safely. On the morning of the 26th of February, 1945, it took off from Kwajalein at 10:45 in the morning, bound for Hawaii on the long overwater leg, with Washington beyond that. The weather was not the villain here. The sky was broken cloud between 3,000 and 6,000 feet, unremarkable flying weather. At 12:15, the aircraft radioed its position, out over the empty water, roughly at 11 degrees 15 minutes north latitude and 174 degrees 15 minutes east longitude. That was the last anyone ever heard from it. On board, according to the manifest recorded by Pacific Rex, were 10 men. The pilot and co-pilot and the flight crew, Lieutenant General Millard Harmon, a colonel named William Bell, a senior officer of the 20th Air Force, and Brigadier General James Anderson, Harmon's chief of staff. I want to pause on Anderson because here is one of those small, cruel ironies that this story is full of. The great air base on Guam, Anderson Air Force Base, still one of the most important American bases in the Pacific to this day, is named for that brigadier general who went down beside Harmon. It is not named for Harmon. The men were lost together, and one of them got a famous base, and the other, the three-star general, the senior man, got a smaller field on Guam that closed a few years after the war and faded into an industrial district. The junior officer is remembered in the name every airman knows. The senior one is not. Even in death, the pattern held. He did not vanish alone, and the other names deserve to be spoken too. The pilot was Major Francis Savage. Beside him sat a co-pilot, a first lieutenant named Jack West. There was a navigator, a major named Archibald Anderson, and a radio operator and 2 flight engineers, sergeants all. There was the colonel, William Bell, one of the senior operations officers of the 20th Air Force, and there was Brigadier General James Anderson, the chief of staff. 10 men, most of them young, all of them gone in an instant that left no trace. When a general is lost, the enlisted men who go down with him tend to disappear from the story entirely, and I do not want to do that here. They were a crew doing their job on a routine flight across the ocean, and they deserve to be remembered as more than a footnote to a general's mystery. The aftermath followed the cold arithmetic of the missing. For a year and a day, the 10 men were carried on the rolls as missing because the law required that interval before a missing man could be declared dead. On the 27th of February, 1946, 6 months after the war itself had ended, the declarations were finally signed. By then, the world had moved on to peace, and the loss of a lieutenant general in the last winter of the war was old news that had never really been news at all. There is exactly one book-length biography of Millard Harmon, written decades later by a retired officer named Robert Novotny, and titled after the tarmacs and trenches of his career. One book, for a man who commanded a theater, set that beside the shelves, written about the men whose names the new Air Force chose to carve in stone, and you have measured the size of the forgetting. The search was enormous. This was a lieutenant general, one of the most senior officers in the theater. The Navy threw everything it had at finding him. By the account drawn from the official record, the search covered nearly 420,000 square miles of ocean between Kwajalein and Hawaii. Hughes calls it the largest air and sea rescue and recovery effort of the entire war, and it found nothing. Not a raft, not a slick, not a floating seat cushion, not, as one account puts it, as much as a rivet. On the 17th of March, 1945, the search was called off. 1 year and 1 day later, on the 27th of February, 1946, Millard Harmon was officially declared dead. So what happened out there? I have to be honest with you, because false certainty is how this channel loses your trust. Nobody knows. No wreckage was ever found, which means the cause is genuinely, permanently undetermined. We can rule some things out. Enemy action is almost impossible. By that point in the war, Japanese air power near the Marshalls had been swept from the sky. The weather was benign. What remains is the airplane itself. The C-87 had a poor safety reputation among the men who flew it. It was known for trouble in its fuel system, for the risk of fire, and for dangerous behavior in icing conditions. A mechanical failure, a fire, a structural problem far out over the water where there was no place to go and no one to see, that is the most plausible explanation. But plausible is not proven, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The ocean simply took him, and it never gave a reason. There's a broader truth buried in that airplane, and the men of this audience who worked the flight lines will recognize it. The transport that carried Harmon was a bomber wearing a different coat. The C-87 was pressed into service because the Army desperately needed long-range transports, and the Liberator had the range, so they pulled the guns and the bomb racks out and put seats and cargo in. But it was never really designed for the job, and it carried the Liberator's known weaknesses, its temperamental fuel system chief among them, into a role that demanded absolute reliability over thousands of miles of water. Across the Pacific, over the mountains of Asia, and along every long ferry route of the war, airplanes like this one went into the sea for reasons no one ever established, taking their crews and their passengers into an ocean that keeps its secrets. Harmon, who had spent his whole career worrying about the machines and the men and the vast, unforgiving distances, was in the end taken by exactly the combination he understood best. There is a hard irony in that, and I do not think he would have missed it. Now let me give you the numbers that frame the scale of this loss, because I promised you the arithmetic, and because it is genuinely staggering. Millard Harmon was one of only 4 American lieutenant generals to lose their lives in the entire Second World War. The others were Frank Maxwell Andrews, who went down in a bomber in Iceland, Leslie McNair, lost in Normandy, and Simon Bolivar Buckner, lost in Okinawa. 4 3-star officers. Out of the millions of Americans who served, Harmon was one of them. And of the airmen among them, he was the highest-ranking American air commander lost in the Pacific in the whole war. Let that settle. Not a lieutenant, not a captain, not even a colonel. A lieutenant general commanding an entire theater's worth of Army air power, gone in an afternoon, and the country barely paused. Set him beside the other 3, and the unfairness comes into focus. Frank Andrews, lost in a bomber in Iceland in 1943, has a major air base named for him just outside Washington, the field that for decades flew the presidents of the United States, and we have told his story on this channel. Leslie McNair, the man who trained the American Ground Army, is studied in every serious history of how that army was built, and the manner of his loss in Normandy is written about to this day. Simon Bolivar Buckner, who commanded the 10th Army on Okinawa, is remembered as the highest-ranking American officer lost to enemy fire in the entire war. 3 of the 4 are held in memory, honored, argued over, kept alive, and the 4th, the airman, the one who commanded a theater's worth of air power and vanished into the sea, is the one you had never heard of before today. The same rank, the same sacrifice. 4 men who reached the very top and gave everything. 3 remembered, 1 erased. If that does not tell you that memory is a choice and not a reward, I do not know what would. Consider the distances that swallowed him, because they tell you why he was never found. The leg he was flying, from Kwajalein to Hawaii, is roughly 2,100 nautical miles of open water. The full run from Guam to Hawaii is around 3,300 nautical miles. These are the widths of the Pacific, and an airplane that goes into that water without a distress call is a coin dropped into an ocean. Even 420,000 square miles of searching is a small patch against that vastness. And consider what he built and sustained, the machine he handed to other men. The bomber bases in the Marianas that he was responsible for supporting grew into some of the largest airfields on Earth. Tinian's North Field alone, with its 4 long runways, became for a time the busiest airport in the world, packed with hundreds of superfortresses. From those fields, he helped make possible the strategic air campaign against Japan flew more than 27,000 bomber sorties in the war's final year. When the island of Iwo Jima was taken, in part to give the bombers a place to land in emergencies, more than 2,000 superfortresses would eventually make emergency landings there, and by the estimate carried in the histories, that single island may have saved as many as 22,000 airmen who would otherwise have gone into the sea, the same sea that took Harmon. The base network on Guam that he built grew so large that by August of 1945, it supported more than 200,000 American personnel. Miff Harmon was the quartermaster of the apocalypse. He laid the foundation for the entire final act of the Pacific Air War, and then he was gone before the curtain fell, and the men who took the last bow were other men. There is a bitter symmetry in Harmon's war that I cannot get out of my mind. Remember where he started, back in early 1942, as Chief of the Air Staff in Washington, one of the men holding the pencil that divided airplanes and fuel and pilots among the theaters. He had sat at the top of the pipeline and decided who would go without. And then he was sent to the very end of that same pipeline, to the theater that always went without, and he spent the rest of his life fighting to pry loose the resources and the authority that a headquarters far away kept deciding to withhold. The man who had once done the rationing spent his war on the receiving end of it, and at the very end, the one thing he could not pry loose, the operational control of the bombers, the authority to match his responsibility, was the very thing he died trying to obtain. He went to Washington to argue with the machine he had once helped run. He never arrived. I find it hard to imagine a career that comes full circle more completely or more cruelly than that one. I want to be fair here, because hero worship is not what this channel does, and because the fairest historians are not worshipful either. Hughes, who admires Harmon, is also honest about his flaws. He notes that Harmon had a tendency to meddle in the fine details of his subordinates' commands, to reach down further into the machinery than a commander at his level should. And Hughes observes that Harmon had less direct success supervising the air war itself than he did running the theater's logistics and ground affairs, partly because the Pacific was already crowded with strong naval airmen. So he was not flawless. No real commander is. But a man does not have to be flawless to be badly wronged by history, and Harmon was badly wronged. Which brings us to the question this whole video has been circling. Why have you never heard of him? A man this senior, this capable, this essential, lost in a mystery this dramatic, and yet almost invisible. How does that happen? The answer is not that he did too little. The answer, I have come to believe, is that he did the wrong kind of thing to be remembered by the institution that came after him. Think about what Harmon's war actually was. It was joint. It was cooperative. His greatest achievement was making the Army Air Forces work smoothly underneath a Navy theater commander, sharing control, subordinating his own service's pride to the common mission. He was the airman the admirals trusted. He was the general who could sit in a room with Halsey and Nimitz and make the machine run. And when the war ended, and the Air Force finally won its long fight to become an independent service in 1947, that was not the story it wanted to tell about itself. Hughes says this better than I can, so let me give you his words as closely as I can. He writes that after the war, the Army and the Navy each had their own heroes to memorialize, and that Harmon's joint service legacy poorly fit the needs of a newly independent Air Force. The young Air Force needed champions of air power as an independent, war-winning force, all its own. It heralded the men who fit that image, the strategic bombing men, Jimmy Doolittle, Carl Spaatz, Curtis LeMay. It did not have much use for a general whose greatest gift was making air power serve smoothly inside somebody else's theater. Hughes's conclusion is blunt, and I think correct. Harmon, he writes, deserves his place in that pantheon. He simply never got it. And so the man who fought for the correct doctrine on the fighters and lost to LeMay watched LeMay become a legend while he became a footnote. The man whose joint command was a model of how services should cooperate was forgotten by a service that wanted to prove it did not need anyone else. His name went onto a field on Guam and then came off it. His younger brother's name went onto the Air Force Academy. And the base that everyone remembers on Guam honors the chief of staff who died beside him. Everywhere you look in the story, the credit flowed to someone else. That is not bad luck repeated a dozen times. That is a pattern, and the pattern has a name, and the name is politics. And I believe politics is what erased Millard Harmon far more completely than the ocean ever did. Let me widen the lens for a moment, because Harmon's frustration was not just his own. It was a symptom of a disease that ran through the entire Pacific War, and the best historians name it plainly. The Pacific was fought under a divided command, split between MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific and Nimitz in the Pacific Ocean areas, with no single overall commander for the whole theater. The historian Lewis Morton, in a classic lecture on Pacific Command, concluded that true unity of command was never really achieved out there. And into the seams of that divided arrangement, into the gaps between the Army and the Navy, and between the theaters and Washington, fell a great deal, including, I would argue, the career and the memory of a genuinely excellent airman. Harmon spent his war trying to make a broken command structure function through sheer cooperation and competence. It is a bitter irony that the same broken structure, the same tangle of who reported to whom and who controlled which airplanes, is what put him on that flight to Washington in the first place. It is worth saying plainly why the record on Harmon is so thin, because the thinness is itself part of the story. The official history of the Army Air Forces, the multi-volume work by Wesley Frank Craven and James Lee Cate, covers his commands and the great campaigns he served, and it is the bedrock source for all of it. The strange business of the 20th Air Force, run from Washington by Arnold, is documented thoroughly by the Air Force historian Herman Wolk. The divided nature of Pacific Command is dissected by Lewis Morton, but Harmon himself, the man, sits in the seams of all of it, mentioned in passing, central to nothing, because the histories are organized around campaigns and around the famous commanders who fought them, and Harmon was the man in the middle who made the campaigns possible without ever owning one. He is in the footnotes of everyone else's chapter, and that, more than the ocean, is what erased him. The ocean took his life in a single afternoon. The way we choose to write our history took his memory over the decades that followed, one book that never got written at a time. There is one more piece of operational detail I want to give you, because it is the kind of thing this audience appreciates and because it captures the man. Consider the paradox of Harmon and the bomber doctrine. He came out of the Air Corps Tactical School, the temple of precision daylight bombing. He was inside the institution when the theory was written. And yet, by the end, he was the man arguing for flexibility, for adapting the weapon to the reality of the theater, against the rigid application of doctrine that LeMay was demanding for the fighters. Harmon had made the journey that the theory's true believers never quite made. He'd started as a keeper of the doctrine and become a servant of the mission. He understood, in a way the schoolhouse never taught, that the map is not the territory, that the elegant theory drawn on a chalkboard in Alabama had to bend to the winds over Tokyo and the distances across the Marshalls and the hard facts of a two-ocean war. That is wisdom. It is exactly the wisdom you want in a senior commander. And it is exactly the wisdom that got him overruled by a more junior man with a simpler, more aggressive idea and a louder voice. To my mind, that is the deepest tragedy here. Not just that he was lost. Men were lost every day in that war, and Harmon would have been the first to say his life was worth no more than a tail gunner's. The tragedy is that the most experienced air judgment in the Pacific Ocean areas was overruled, and then removed by the sea, and then written out of the story, all inside a few weeks. The country lost not just a general, but the accumulated wisdom of a man who had learned the hard lessons that his own service was about to spend the next decade relearning. Before I give you my final verdict, I want to turn to you, because so many of you carry this history in your own families. This was the great Pacific air machine, and hundreds of thousands of Americans built it and flew it and serviced it. If your father or your grandfather flew with the 13th Air Force in the Solomons, or turned wrenches on the big superfortresses on Guam or Tinian or Saipan, or worked the flight line or the supply chain anywhere under Miff Harmon's command in the South Pacific or the Pacific Ocean areas, I would genuinely like to hear about it. Those stories are the real record, the one that does not fade, and this is exactly the kind of man whose legacy survives in them. Drop them in the comments. Some of the best history on this channel comes from you, so here is my verdict, for whatever one man's judgment is worth. Millard Fillmore Harmon was one of the finest air commanders the United States produced in the Second World War, and he is one of the least remembered because his greatest virtues were the ones his own service chose to forget. He was a joint commander in an age that came to worship the independent striking force. He was a cooperator in a service that needed to prove it could stand alone. He was right about the fighters when it counted, and being right earned him nothing but an argument he had to fly halfway around the world to make. He built the foundation for the final destruction of Japanese resistance from the air, and then he vanished into the ocean before the world could see the results. And other men took the applause. The men above him knew his worth. Halsey, who did not hand out praise lightly, called his contributions outstanding. Nimitz called him first-rate. Arnold trusted him with the largest air force on Earth. And then, when it was over, the institution moved on and let his name slip beneath the surface as completely as his airplane did. He deserved better. He deserves, at the very least, for the people who love this history to know that he existed, to know what he did, and to know that when the highest-ranking American airman in the Pacific tried to tell his superiors they had the command arrangement wrong, he was right, and it was the last thing he ever got to say. The ocean never gave him back. The least we can do is give him back his name. Millard Fillmore Harmon, Miff, Lieutenant General, lost over the Pacific on the 26th of February, 1945, doing the thing he did his whole career, which was trying to get it right. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.